Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Weather Lounge here at WeatherWorks. I'm your host, meteorologist Mike Mahalik. And well, lately, we've been getting several calls asking, is winter over? And after February didn't quite work out as we planned for the cold and snow, we can't blame anyone for asking that question now that we're into March. So we'll answer that burning winter cancel question that we're getting and why the February pattern fell apart. But we invited back long range meteorologist Kyle Leahy to discuss all of these things of what happened in February and what we're expecting through the rest of March and into April. So, Kyle, is winter over?
Yeah, so it kind of depends on where you're at, sort of in the Northeast or the Midwest. You can't really give one umbrella answer, but I would say as of right now, it's a little bit too early to fully cancel everything. You still got a lot of time. So I'll share my screen in a little bit so I can just kind of elaborate on what I'm talking about, I guess.
Great, Kyle. So let's take a look at the pattern. Let's dive right into it.
All right, cool. So this is kind of where we're at right now. This is a view of pretty much just the entire northern hemisphere. A lot of these reds that you're seeing are areas of high pressure, and a lot of the blues, greens, and purples that you're seeing are low pressure. So let's just do kind of like a broad 5-day view, just kind of smooth out a lot of the little
Yeah.
rough edges, I guess.
And Kyle, be sure to explain to people who are not on our video, watching this on YouTube. Some may be listening on our podcast.
Hmm.
So, when you're talking about your highs and low pressures, make sure you give a location
Yeah.
so people can follow along if they're not on the video. And if you're just listening to the podcast, head over to our YouTube channel, well, at WeatherWorks.
All right. So kind of what we're looking at. This is from like pretty much most of this week's from the 4th to the 9th. Um, it's pretty well defined by like a large area of high pressure, pretty much centered right over the Northeast.
Hmm.
Um, a lot of low pressure over the West. And you have the polar vortex up here with this area of low pressure that's centered right over the pole, which is, I guess, where it should be. But in terms of like displacing cold air into anywhere in the US, it's not very good. So this is quite a warm pattern. You have the Pacific jet here, you could see it. So even into the west where things are active, you're not really getting that much cold air into the flow. And then for a pattern here, this is probably like the least conducive winter pattern for like at any point in the year. So like it's going to be warm, it's going to be quite rainy for the time being. One thing that I do want to key in on that is somewhat interesting is this big area of high pressure over like Scandinavia. And a lot of the time, what these do is I'll just kind of cycle forward a little bit. Is you'll kind of see that area kind of just migrate to the west. So then you end
Mm.
up, this is kind of like Sunday of next week into Friday, right? So
We're
now
looking
it's
at
like,
the 10th through the 15th of March, something like that.
yep, exactly. So now things have kind of switched up a little bit. I still wouldn't call it favorable for winter here. It just isn't yet because it's too warm. But now you have a lot of those lower pressures kind of centered like to the south of Alaska, over Alaska, and then kind of over the pole again. And now that big high pressure is kind of centered near the Davis Strait, which is basically kind of like west of Greenland, more or less,
Hmm.
in northern Canada. You get a little bit more high pressure starting to set up over the west. And you have a large area of low pressure centered kind of like over the northern Atlantic. So now you're kind of transitioning into more of a blocky pattern rather than just one that's very warm here. Uh, with this kind of snapshot, it's blocky and warm, which is possible if the air that you're blocking up, so to speak, is just from the Pacific. So that's kind of what we're dealing with there. This is kind of like a bit of a step towards a colder pattern coming up.
Yeah, I would agree. It does look like a pattern that is starting to get. You're starting to see the hallmarks
Yeah,
of
yeah, something. Yeah,
some colder, snowier weather, possibly.
yeah.
But again, it takes everything to fall into place to get one of those big storms to happen. So,
Yep.
this is an overall northern hemisphere pattern that we're looking at. So,
Yep.
We're not talking about those individual storm pieces just yet, and
Mm. Yeah.
they always have to come together at the right time. But why don't you take us through this next period? Because I think we're starting to get into that period, Kyle, where we're seeing that pattern change. And I know you have mentioned before that, at least to me, that things get a little bit more conducive.
Yeah, exactly. So now we'll kind of step through the 5 days afterwards.
Mm,
So now oop, one sec. So now we're pretty much talking this is from, like, the 14th through the 19th, or we could
gotcha.
even kinda so since this is a 5-day average, you can even narrow it down a little bit towards, like, the 16th to the 17th or the 17th to the 18th. So at this point, what's happened is that a lot of that high pressure that was originally over here, all the way out near Scandinavia,
Hmm.
that's gone, and that has pretty much migrated or retrograded, which is just when things kinda move, east to west instead of west to east as they usually do. That's moved all the way over to, like, Western Canada. There's still a little bit of residual high pressure, kind of over Greenland and whatnot. There's a pretty strong signal again for that what we call an Aleutian low, named after the islands near Alaska, to set up. You have that low pressure kind of in a northern Atlantic, and now you have it like a nice trough of low pressure over the east. So this is um, like quite a good pattern. The only issue with this is that it's now March 18th. That's kind of the kicker. So that can't be ignored. If we were seeing this pattern showing up in honestly even early March, like if this was 2 weeks ago, or if this pattern was in place now, it would be much easier to get like considerable snow chances.
Right. I
Yeah.
mean, and you think about going into mid-March, now we have a higher sun angle.
Yeah.
The cold air isn't as available as it used to be.
Yep.
So you got to kind of have everything fall into place just right. I mean, even if you have snow during the day and it's a steady snow, but it's not really, moderate to heavy,
Yeah.
it gets really hard for those pavements to start actually accumulating during the day. So, it gets a little bit difficult. It can
Mhm.
happen, obviously. We've seen it
Y-
happen in the past plenty of times.
Yeah.
But, you know, if you get that storm happening at night, that's always a good thing because you don't have the
Mhm.
sun working on those pavements if you're looking for snow to accumulate. Now, if you're not looking for snow to accumulate, you want it to snow during the day.
Yes. Yep.
But
Exactly.
yeah, I mean the pattern there, Kyle. Man, that looks probably as good as a pattern we've seen most of the winter. I'd say with that big high and that big high pressure ridge pushing through the west, and a nice trough in the east. I like it.
Yep. Pretty much. Yeah. Yeah. So basically this trough in like kind of in theory would provide you with that kind of better air mass. And then as we step through just a little bit farther, you can see how it kind of kicks out a little bit
Hmm.
into the Atlantic. That's where you would want a system basically after this one moves out a little bit. You would want a system to kind of strengthen somewhere in here, kind of like in this area to take
In the
advantage
northern
of that.
plains or something
Yeah,
like that.
exactly. So that you have a short window basically. You probably have a window somewhere between like the 20th and the 25th, because after the
Right.
25th, unless you're in like interior New England or above like 1,500 feet in elevation, it gets really tough. Like regardless of the pattern,
Right.
you pretty much need, and it's certainly not impossible. There was like there was early April 2018 where like the like New York City got 5 inches of snow. It's
Right.
not it's not something that's impossible. I think even in 1998, which was also a very strong El Nino, there was another I think pretty much all of New York City's snow. They got like 5 inches that year, and it all occurred in like late March, and it was like 80 degrees for a week afterward. So
Yeah.
it's not something that's unheard of. But I would say if if there were to be one of those anomalous late season events, this is like the pattern that you would need in order for that to occur, pretty much.
All right. So we're in that good pattern, Kyle.
Yeah.
Where does it go from there as we head, say past March 20th and going into the end of March?
Yeah. So basically, a lot of the time, these patterns, well, I guess to preface quickly, the reason why we're getting a lot of that blocking in the first place that's setting up kind of like over Greenland and whatnot is because the polar vortex, which it often does at this time of year because it just weakens once you get into the spring, it's weakening quite a bit. And the winds up top, instead of, turning counterclockwise as they usually do with low pressure, they're now spinning clockwise. So it's a pretty big disruption. And
Hmm,
that's how you get colder air in. So
gotcha.
a lot of the time when that happens, these patterns can have a tendency to stick around a little bit. So let's kind of cycle through. This is March 20th. We'll cycle through until, like first few days of April. So at
Hmm,
this point, everything's a bit more washed out because once you get into the spring, um, getting larger scale kind of waves just in general, I guess a good way to visualize it is like you can literally see just a series of waves showing up. So like this is a low pressure, that's high pressure, that's low pressure. So these waves shrink as you get um farther
right.
into the spring. So it's a lot more difficult to be like, oh, like there's a ridge in the west, so that means it's going to be cold in the east. It doesn't exactly work like that once you get into April. So
Yeah, because the ridge in the west might have the trough cutting more through the central portion of the United States
yeah.
and then cutting up through,
Hmm.
the eastern Great Lakes or something rather
Yeah.
than being off the coast. So they
Hmm.
kind of just shorten up a little bit
Yep.
rather than being these big long ways where you have a big ridge in the west and then the trough of low pressure diving. If you can envision the jet stream kind of pushing up through um, Canada, diving through the central portion of the country and going off the east coast,
Yep.
forming those nor'easters. That's what we typically see in the winter. So
Hmm.
basically, take that pattern and just kind of
Shrink it. Yeah.
squeeze it down a little bit, and
Hmm.
that's what starts happening as we head into spring.
Yep. So given that we're already likely going to see blocking, just a blocky pattern at the end of March, they do generally kind of stick around a little bit once you get into April. Like I wouldn't count on that pattern being so quick to end. And this doesn't even necessarily have much to do with snow at this point, because again, once you get into April, you're probably raining pretty much everywhere. But once you get farther into April, I would expect things to warm up quite a bit. I mean, we're likely entering into a La Nina instead of an El Nino. Those are usually on the drier and warmer side once you get, more towards, like summer, late spring. So, and also a lot of the analogs that we use to kind of forecast March, which will end up on the warmer side as we expected, regardless of any colder spell that might happen later in the month. April also does look quite warm, mainly in like the northern plains and whatnot, but a lot of the time that warmth kind of leaks a little bit farther east.
Right. So, Kyle, if we were to highlight a period where you think the best chance for a decent storm would be here in the late winter,
Mhm.
um, where would you kind of put that?
Yeah, I would say around like the 20th to the 25th as you see this low kind of just migrate to the east. You would kind of want it to set up somewhere over here more or less.
Hmm.
Like that low pressure moves out there and then you try to get something diving from the north, tapping into something in the south, and then it takes advantage of that low pressure because a lot of the time that like a low pressure here will create a nice high and then
Hmm.
you try to get some kind of um and like
Gotcha.
the prerequisite here is strong. You would need a strong system too. You can't like most of the time you can't just have a weak sauce because you need like a dynamic storm at this
Yeah,
point.
you need a spicy storm is what he's
Yeah,
trying to say. No,
pretty
not
much.
no mild sauce storm is what he's going for.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
go for the fire sauce over at Taco Bell, right?
Yeah.
Um, so So anyway, okay, so the 20th through the 25th,
Yep.
looks like the period to be watching out for, and that would be, a larger storm. Um, Again, like we said before, we need all those pieces to fall in place just right,
Yep.
especially this late in the year. But
Exactly.
that would be the potential that we're looking for. So that's why we can't really say, okay, winter's over, there's no
Yeah.
chance, because even looking back into history and looking at past storms, there has been big storms in March. It takes a lot to get them all together, but when they do, you have some really big ones. I mean, just a few years ago, we had that parade of nor'easters in March. Now, I know we're not looking at anything like that,
Yeah,
Kyle. But just to give an example, that March can produce
yeah.
some storms. But
Certainly. If we were looking at the pattern that we have now, like if we were looking at this kind of pattern where you just have, as I showed earlier, all that high pressure over the east, if we were seeing that on March
mhm,
15th, March 20th, then it's done. Like you can almost certainly just be like, it's just too warm. There's no
right,
way. Everything's going to cut to the west. There's just no shot. But
right.
that's kind of just not really the case.
Until something stupid happens on like Mother's Day, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But okay, Kyle. So as far as temperatures go, looking at the Midwest first, and then the Mid Atlantic and Northeast. So in the Midwest, what would you expect temperatures for the period? Let's take basically mid-March, through early April. What do you see as far as temperatures in that period?
Yeah, so I would say generally with this kind of pattern, your a lot of your flow is mostly coming out of here. So you could literally just follow these lines,
From
and
straight out of Canada.
yep, and even a little bit of polar influence too.
Hmm.
So it's generally quite cold. I would expect most of the coldest air, a lot of the time, kind of dumps into like the northern plains, and then it kind of moderates as it moves east. So I would say like that late March period after the 15th is probably going to be like decently below our average. But
Okay.
you're talking about March below average. So, you're not going to be expecting any kind of like Arctic
Sure.
outbreak or anything like that, but below average.
So
I
below average in the Midwest and then moderating a little bit
yep.
to, still maybe below average in the Northeast, but not quite as cold as the Midwest will be.
Yeah, exactly. And also, you would probably get your like biggest anomalies in like the southeast,
Okay.
but it's not as cold. Like it's
Gotcha.
just easier to get colder anomalies in the southeast because it's tougher to get that cold this late, more or less.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So, all right. So that's during our period that we're looking at. I imagine as we go through April, that just kind of moderates to more spring-like
Yeah.
temperatures then.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, you're probably still gonna be, a bit below average, but there
Hmm.
isn't as much confidence. The patterns generally don't have as much oomph as they do at this point in
Right.
the year. So, yeah, like it's probably gonna be also a lot of the time you can get below average, but not necessarily because it's like a cold pattern, just because it's like cloudy all the time too. Like if it's
Mm,
unsettled, you'll still be below average solely because
gotcha.
there isn't a lot of sun.
All right. So, Kyle, I thought for looking at snowfall, instead of just saying below average, near average, above average, it might be
Yeah, yeah.
fun to do a little kind of over under sort of game, for cities from the Midwest into the Northeast. Okay. So,
Yeah, yeah.
what I've pulled is some climatology data taking us from March 15th through the month of April. So over the last 15 years, this is the amount of snowfall that's usually seen. So that's what
Hmm.
we're going with here. So
Yeah.
if we start in Chicago, Kyle, we have 2.6 inches usually from March 15th through April. What do we think? Higher, lower, over, under?
I would probably say under. Only
Okay.
because yeah, only because here, it's pretty tough to, like, get that many systems. Like, it's kind of a dry-ish pattern most of the time because
Gotcha.
your systems like to strengthen kind of like so if this is where the trough is, basically, like this dotted line, you kinda want to be to the east of that line because most of the time, you normally get a lot of high pressure kind of, like,
Over the
downstream
plain
of this
states.
ridge.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
gotcha.
exactly, exactly.
All right. So if we shift to Indianapolis, they have 2 inches during this period. About the same thing as Chicago, you think, the under?
Yeah, I will say I find it kind of surprising that they're that close. Like, I feel like it would be a little bit easier for Chicago to to like hit the over than Indy,
Right.
just given that it's not that much more snow. They have better latitude and they're farther west.
Yep.
But yeah, I'd probably have to agree.
Okay, and then over into Ohio, we're looking at Columbus at 1.1 inches.
Honestly, 1.1, like That's I mean it really only takes like a couple days. So honestly, you could with this kind of pattern, it wouldn't be that shocking if they kind of exceeded that. If it's only that
Okay.
little.
Sounds like we got
Mm.
a possible over
Yeah.
there over in Ohio.
Yeah.
Heading into the Mid-Atlantic, we're looking at Baltimore and Philadelphia, both at 1.2 inches.
Mm.
Ah, you
That's
stumped on
tough.
the over/under here.
Yeah, no. It's tough because they're so far south,
Gotcha.
basically. But again, like the issue is that March, it's like it's so boom or bust that it's really
Right.
like if you get something, it won't be that hard to do it. It's just can you actually pull it off?
Right.
Um, so I guess for Baltimore, I would probably say under. For Philly, I have a easier chance saying over or at least closer to over for sure
So
up
probably
there.
more like a near normal
Near
thing, or
normal-ish.
and
Yeah,
if you
yeah.
get something to work out, over.
Yes, exactly. Yeah,
Same
pretty
thing
much.
for Newark, New Jersey. Around New York City, we have 1.5 inches.
Yeah, I'd probably say the same thing with, like same thing as Philly. Uh, it's yeah, it could really go either way for them, honestly.
Yeah, so that's the thing about March storms. I mean, just like
It's
you said,
tough.
Kyle, I mean, you can get one. It could be a big one. I mean, like
Yeah.
March 93, I know that was crazy,
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
anomalous storm that you never really see. However, things like that happen. It could be really energetic systems, really energetic storms, and things can happen. But you know, sometimes they don't. But and the last city we have here is Boston, has 2.0 inches for this time period. What do you think?
I would probably say over. Boston's the easiest one, like that's probably it's the easiest for me to say over for that one because I mean,
Gotcha.
they have good latitude. They're to the east of the trough. It's like they generally can just snow a lot later.
Right.
So yeah, and the fact that it's only 2, yeah, might as well. It could be quite stormy.
Gotcha. And maybe even a little bit west of
Oh,
Boston, because I
yeah, no,
know
definitely.
we've been struggling
Yeah,
sometimes with that
yeah,
easterly
yeah, yeah,
wind through
yeah.
the year, where we can't seem to break that, and the snow is happening further west than Boston itself. But
Exactly.
um, all right, Kyle. I mean, good stuff. Unfortunately, we are going to have to backtrack for the second half of this video a
Yeah, yeah.
little bit. I know it's the elephant in the room here. But Kyle, I mean, we have to discuss what happened in February, because things are looking so good.
Yep.
But before you answer, we're going to take a quick break, and on the other side of the break, we'll bring back Kyle, and we'll discuss what happened in February. Back after this. Okay, and we're back. I'm meteorologist Mike Mahalik, your host, and I'm here with long range meteorologist Kyle Leahy once again. And Kyle, like we said before the break, man, February, it looks so good across the board for cold and snow, and then it just didn't come together in a meaningful way. So, Kyle, I mean, what happened here? What broke down? What went wrong in this pattern that you saw? And a lot of
Yeah.
people did see the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. It was a pretty, a lot of people like to use the term hype. Um,
Uh,
it's like there were many, including me as well. I will own it. That we're looking at everything, and
right,
given how much sense it made for it to occur, there was the El Nino coming up. There was the Pacific Jet kind of backing off a little bit. There was the MJO, like the tropical stuff. There was the stratosphere stuff. Like pretty much everything was seemed to be kind of falling into place for this. And
right.
just
And I remember even talking
yeah,
outside of the podcast here,
yeah,
and the video that we did, that you were like, I keep trying to find something wrong.
it just
And
yeah, no,
every
literally.
time I'm looking, I can't. And it was a lot of people were on the same
Yep.
thinking and idea.
Yep.
So it's almost shocking that it didn't work out. I don't know.
Yep.
Are the patterns might be shifting their influence a little
Mhm.
bit. than what we're used to, or what, as of late. But I mean, Kyle, let's just go through what ultimately broke this thing down.
Yeah. So just to give some context, this was a forecast from the beginning of February. So this is the February 2nd's forecast on one of the major models,
Hmm.
basically, and this was valid for the 15th. So
So February 15th.
yeah, so mid month. So again, just quickly characterized by you have a lot of low pressure south of pretty much southwest of Alaska. You have a lot of high pressure over Alaska, high pressure over Greenland, very strong high pressure over Greenland, and a very large trough over the eastern United States. So the jet stream basically looks like this.
Yep.
It's going
It
right up into Alaska, right back down, and you
Big
have a
trough of low
yep,
pressure over the eastern portion of the United States. Looks like a classic setup for big
yeah,
storms.
yep. This is basically exactly how you would draw it up. Pretty much every model looked like this for quite a while. And the impetus for this blocking forming, which is probably, I'll kind of get to the reason why it most likely broke down in the way that it did. Um, you had, so that system that went through, I believe it was the 13th, that dropped a lot of snow over like a good portion of the Northeast, I'd say, like, from a lot of Jersey into southern New England, like Connecticut and whatnot.
Hmm.
Um, that system, what it was originally supposed to do, it wasn't even actually supposed to even be a snowstorm. That
Right.
system was supposed to, I'll just kind of overlay it on this. That system, which is smoothed out in here, and all these blues, that system is there. It's
Hmm.
just kind of smudged. Was supposed to basically take this track. Supposed
So
to be very strong.
more of an interior track, maybe
Yeah,
west of the Appalachians.
yeah, exactly. It's basically just supposed to be a cutter right through the Great Lakes, just cut right through the lakes. And what that was going to do is basically lead to a whole bunch of warm air getting shot right into Greenland, more or less.
Mm.
This is what we call wave breaking. So I'm not sure how that gets tossed around a lot more than it used to. That seems to be kind of almost buzzwordish now.
Hmm.
Basically, all that means is that you're transporting a lot of that warmer air into a place it really shouldn't be. Um, that
Makes sense.
place would be Greenland. And what happens is that when and it was difficult to see this. I mean, it's easier to see it in hindsight now,
Sure.
but that was like the first domino in like the chain of events, more or less. So instead of that system amplifying and getting really strong and taking that track pretty much northeast, there was the whole fiasco while that storm was occurring and how quickly it weakened. That was its own little thing and a pretty spectacular model collapse, more or less, in the short range. That was only a
Hmm.
day out. So when you have that system weakening, and also that system was kind of weakening from, I guess, a cutter into more of like a southwest flow event, or like a typical kind of like New England storm where you kind of have just you know it's technically an interior storm,
Sure.
but not to the same degree. So you could only see the blocking weakening a little bit, but it was still there. It just wasn't as anomalous as what we're seeing here. But when that system weakened and sheared out, and you basically have it taking this sort of track where it goes right off the coast and it's a lot weaker, you don't have the same warm air transport into Greenland. It doesn't
Right.
happen.
So it's
So,
not taking that track west of the Appalachians. Now it's
yeah,
coming out of the south and going through the Carolinas and
yes,
going off the coast.
exactly. So that was a pretty big impact, I would say. Um, again,
So
it was
now
difficult.
you're not, I'm just learning here.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Now
yeah.
you're not shoving all that warm air into Greenland like you wanted to earlier in the pattern.
Yep.
While that system brought some snow, to Pennsylvania and New
Yeah.
Jersey and the Mid-Atlantic and parts of southern New England, um, you know, we didn't ultimately get it what we wanted it to do for the pattern afterwards.
Exactly. Yeah. So it actually kind of it ended up almost sort of ironic where that first system that was supposed to be like a bonus if you were
Right.
looking for snow anyway. That was supposed to be like, okay, if you get something out of that, then rejoice because like that's not even the main show.
Yeah, that wasn't what we're looking for.
Ironically, that system ended up being a significant snowstorm for a good amount of
Mm.
people,
Yep.
and it tanked the pattern, which obviously rooting for things with weather is kind of dumb because it doesn't really matter. It's going to happen regardless of what you want.
Sure.
If the if the weather happened the way that people wanted it to, it would be quite different. I'm sure a lot of people would hate it,
Right.
for one way or the other. It would either be 70 and sunny all the time, or it'd be snowing all the time. But that was probably the biggest contributing factor. And I guess to kind of illustrate this in a better way, um, I will show this kind of loop, and I'll explain because it's moving pretty quickly, but I will illustrate. So basically, you want to look in this area near Greenland over here, pretty
Mhm.
much, and you also want to look in the Pacific. You also kind of want to look in this area over here. So let's focus on Greenland first. So I guess to again provide more context of what we're looking at, this is valid for the same exact time. All of these images are showing pretty much like the third week of February, around the 22nd.
Around President's Day, somewhere in there.
Exactly, and these are a week's worth of model projections. So these
Mm.
are valid for the same exact time, but this is basically showing how what the model had transformed over time. So this is going from a long range forecast to more of a medium range forecast, and you're seeing how the model was wrong more or less. So these runs started around the 7th and we're ending on Valentine's Day. So if you look near Greenland, you initially, I'll just wait for this to start up again right around here. You start off with a bunch of high pressure over Greenland in this area.
Right.
And notice how you go from that, especially if you look near Iceland over here,
Mhm.
you go from a large high pressure that's completely blocking the flow up to a vortex.
A
Like,
large low pressure.
yeah, it is like probably it's almost comical to look at actually. Now, like seeing it in this format
Right.
shows the actual like complete like model failure here, basically. Like it's actually a 180, like pretty much. And then in the Pacific, what's also worth looking at is we were initially beforehand looking at what's called an equatorward jet extension. So all that means is that the Pacific jet, you could see it here the entire time it's over here, right?
Mhm.
But I guess looking beforehand, once that loop starts up, I'll just kind of get rid of some of these. So you could see how the jet initially is kind of going like this. If you kind of follow those blues at the very beginning, they're kind of sagging downwards. So that's
So
kind of showing you where the
across the
jet is.
Pacific and
And
kinda into
farther
Southern
south.
California.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So that's called equatorward because it's sagging farther south towards the equator. But what ended up happening is that those models were incorrect with that.
Mm.
And instead of having that, you have what's called a poleward jet extension, where instead you could follow the jet and it pretty much ends up taking this track. So instead of looking something like this, you end up getting something that looks like that. And those have like fundamentally different impacts on the pattern.
Yeah, so for the podcasters out there that are listening, so yeah, so now he's talking about the northward
Yeah.
extension where it
It's into
goes through the
Alaska.
Aleutian Islands and then going into almost like southern Alaska,
Pretty
northern
much.
British Columbia, something like that.
Exactly. So with the equatorward extension where you have the jet crashing into like Southern California, that's actually a good thing because that's how you get what's called split flow, where you
Mm,
have ridging into Alaska, so high pressure poking into Alaska. So you're accessing cold air, but then you're undercutting the cold air with a lot of moisture and a really active storm track. But instead, what we got um, this jet extension into Alaska, which instead actually weakens the ridging poking into
mm,
Alaska. So you ruin your cold air source more or less, and you're not getting that same kind of active storm track. So both of those things occurred in tandem at the same time. So if let's just say for example, if one of them were to happen, let's say that we were to keep that same equatorward jet extension into Southern California, but keep the blocking, that would actually still be a good pattern. Like that in
right.
and of itself would still be good because then you would suppress the storm track farther south. It would be active. You'd have enough cold air. And if you were to get rid of the blocking and keep the ridging into Alaska, you might not get big storms out of it per se, but it would be cold. It'd be active. You'd still, you might get nickel and dimes rather than, like the big money event, but still, but both of them happening was the worst case scenario. And I guess to show this kind of graphically, instead of looking at this kind of stuff, which might be a little bit hectic, we can look at this. And again, I will explain this. because this might look a little bit esoteric, I guess, but I'll explain. So again, all of these are pretty much just graphical ways of showing what I just said, more or less. So these are what we call different regimes. So there's the Pacific Trough, which you could just envision a bunch of low pressure, pretty
Hmm.
much like here, pretty much like in this area right here. So Pacific Trough is characterized by that.
So northern Pacific low pressure, basically.
Yeah, pretty much. Pacific Ridge is in that area that I had shown earlier. Instead of having a bunch of low pressure, you basically have a bunch of high pressure, like in this area.
All
That
right.
is typical with like a La Nina pattern, which we'll also get to, which is why it's so shocking.
Mm,
Um, then the other two are a little bit more self-explanatory. There's the Alaskan Ridge, which is basically just high pressure into Alaska,
mm-hmm.
and then the Greenland High, which is high pressure over Greenland. Which,
Gotcha.
and then this was a forecast that was made on the 4th. So that's similar to around the time that I was showing this.
Yeah. So
So
what
it's
we're
around
looking
then.
at is a bunch of ensemble plots, which is a
Yeah.
bunch of different iterations of a little bit different initial conditions
Mhm.
for, and it just plots a bunch of different solutions as to what these ridges and troughs and things are doing.
Yeah, exactly. So the intention is to increase confidence, which is ironic,
Of course.
as I'll show in a little bit. So this X that you're seeing here on all of these plots is what actually happened,
Gotcha.
as opposed to this kind of spaghetti-ish plot, which again, as Mike was saying, was just, you start out with a bunch of confidence, and as things go out in time, you have a bunch of variation. So those are all the different members showing, and that kind of bold line is the average of those members, which is what you're seeing here. So basically, this is the mean, and these are all of the different kind of regimes that I was telling you about. So and also, the farther up you go on here, the higher confidence that you have in that solution occurring, and the lower you go, the lower confidence you have in that solution occurring, or kind of like the more or less it fits the bill, basically. So
Right.
what we're seeing is that you have a good amount of confidence that that Greenland high regime is going to occur. It's by and large the farthest up. It's
Right.
in the positive y-axis, basically, and then you have the lowest confidence that the Pacific Ridge is going to occur by far, like by far. Look at what actually happened. So instead, what happened was the Pacific Ridge. There is not a single member on this entire plot, and there's like 25 of them that were even above zero, which is basically like no confidence. It's just not like there's no signal in that
There's
area,
like
high
no
or low
chance of
pressure.
that. Yeah.
But instead, you actually get the opposite occurring, where instead of saying, "Oh, there's like a very low chance that you're going to get high pressure in that area," is the other way around. You actually had significant high pressure, and it was the same thing with the Greenland High. So instead, where it's saying, "Oh, we're going to get a lot of blocking," we have very high confidence in that. It was on like there were maybe one or two members. So you're talking about like a 2% chance of that verifying.
Wow.
So it's yeah, in I would say I've been looking at this stuff for like 10
Yeah.
years like this. I can't recall like
This much
something.
discrepancy and
Yeah,
this
no,
much error.
no,
It
not
just
like that.
basically did the opposite of what most of the ensemble members were showing.
Pretty much.
So if you have that happening, you're going
Yeah,
to have a problem.
it's not gonna work. And just to and like again, this isn't a cop out or anything like that, but given the difference, like there is no way that you could have forecasted this. Like at that time, there's just no way because you'd basically have to be like, okay, this is what everything's showing,
Ignoring
but I'm
everything.
just
Yeah.
gonna ignore it and predict the opposite. Like there's just it just wouldn't like because like a valid question might be like, oh well, was there any way that you could have seen this happening?
Right.
And it's honestly like no, like not really. Like there just kind of wasn't
It's
anything.
not even
There's just
within the realm of,
no,
you know, possibilities of this
no.
happening, which just goes to show you like I always find that weather does this to us from time to time, where you really think you have a handle on things, and then every now and then it'll throw you a curveball, and you're
Yeah.
just going, "How did that happen?" You know?
Yeah, there's gonna be
Based on
research
all
done
my
on this.
experience, based on all my pattern recognition, there was no reason for this to happen, and then it
Nope.
does anyway.
Exactly.
So I know we're way better. We're light years ahead of where we used to be. You know, say 20, 30 years ago, in the weather forecasting field and long range prediction. But at the same time, there's always times where things, Mother Nature is going to throw a curveball at you from time to time.
Oh,
So,
totally. Yeah,
um,
and like this, like a lot of the time, what happens? Because of course there's going to be discrepancies. Because you're talking about like a
right.
15-day forecast. What'll normally happen is that instead of maybe getting something, I guess like in here
Yeah.
on this mean, like you're blocking. I know this isn't blocking, but just for the sake of illustration, like it might be a little bit weaker, so you might end up here, or like it
Yeah.
might be a little bit stronger, you might end up there. So, or if a lot of the time at those ranges, you actually don't have a very big signal. So sometimes you might have like a weak block showing up. Like if that doesn't happen, then that's like all right because like there wasn't that big of a signal. Like
Hmm.
that was in the realm of possibility. But just to kind of hammer it home, like to see that big of a signal
Right.
across all guidance blow up is very rare. That's
Right.
it in either direction. In either direction, like it's I'm not sure if you can. I definitely can't recall
Yeah.
like a blowtorch pattern flipping super cold or anything like that. I can't think of one. It doesn't really happen.
Not typically, from
It's
what I've
rare.
seen. I've been doing this a long time too,
Yeah,
so,
much longer
um
than me. So
well, anyway, well, Kyle, I do appreciate you kinda going through that pattern. I mean,
yeah,
and explaining what happened, because you might not hear that from a lot of other outlets. You never know. They might just kind of brush it under the rug. But I like going through what
yeah,
actually happened, so that our listeners and people watching on YouTube know, why we forecasted what we did
yeah,
and what actually happened. And this is why it didn't go the way we expected.
exactly.
Um, so, Kyle, I really appreciate you being here, on our program again, and we'll look forward to your next outlook. And for all those listening, thank you, for visiting here. And remember to catch our company WeatherWorks, on all social media programs out there. Also visit our website, weatherworksinc.com. And for now, we'll have another new podcast coming up in a few weeks. So please visit us once again. But that's it for the show this week. So thanks all that listened.